Ignazio Lupo was born on March 21, 1877 in Palermo, Sicily, to parents Rocco Lupo and Onofria Saietta. Ignazio was one of 9 children born to the couple, having 6 brothers and 2 sisters. Rocco Lupo was a wealthy merchant with ties to the Pagliarelli crime family, the main crime family based in Palermo. When Ignazio turned 18, his father gave him control of a grocery store located at 35 Via Materassi near the Piazza Marina. In 1898, Lupo would begin dealing with a man named Francesco Battaglia. Battaglia often bought items wholesale from Lupo on credit and eventually racked up a tab of 2,000 lira. However, Battaglia would soon become a customer of another store owner, a man named Salvatore Morello. Due to this, Morello demanded Lupo cease doing business with Battaglia. As a result, Lupo would demand Morello pay Battaglia's 2,000 lira debt. After a while of this, Morello would walk into Lupo's store armed with a dagger. A struggle between the two men would ensue before Lupo was able to grab a revolver. Lupo would fire one shot into Morello, dropping him to the ground. Morello would later die from his wounds. Initially, Lupo claimed self-defense, however his parents advised he leave the country to avoid prosecution. This would prove to be the right choice, as on March 12, 1899, Lupo would be indicted on murder charges and tried in absentia. By the time the trial started, Lupo was already in England, having settled in Liverpool. Lupo more than likely established a legitimate grocery business there before deciding to leave. He would move to Montreal, Canada, Buffalo, New York, then Manhattan, New York City, where he ultimately settled. By 1900, Lupo had established a saloon at 8 Prince Street in the Little Italy section of Lower Manhattan. 8 Prince Street was also the address of a restaurant owned by Giuseppe Morello, with the restaurant being located in the basement of the building. Giuseppe Morello was born in Corleone, Sicily in 1867 and arrived in the United States in 1892. In 1893, Morello's family would join him and they would move to Louisiana in search of work. By 1897, however, Morello and his stepfather had established several failed businesses, and the family would ultimately go back to New York, settling in East Harlem in Upper Manhattan. By this point, Morello, who was already a member of the Corleonese Mafia back in Sicily, would begin running his own criminal enterprise. Morello would establish himself as the boss of a Corleonese organization that was mainly involved in counterfeiting. By 1900, Morello had his own crime family, with his organization being one of 3 crime families active in the city. The other 2 were Paolo Orlando's Trapanese family and a Palermitani family that was active in Brooklyn and Lower Manhattan. By the time Lupo and Morello became acquainted in 1900, Morello was the most powerful mafia boss in the city. Eventually, the two became close enough for Morello to back Lupo to take control of the Palermitani family in around 1901. The New York Palermitani family that Lupo eventually took over had the deepest roots out of all 3 families in the city. Its first possible leader, Gaetano Russo, was born in Sicily in 1839 and arrived in the US in 1862, settling in New Orleans. Russo had a very violent reputation and long criminal record. In 1873, he would receive a conviction for arson and spent 2 years in prison. After this, he would relocate to Chicago, Illinois, where in 1876 he would brutally murder a man with a stiletto. However, he was acquitted on these charges, and in 1887 he would finally arrive in New York, where he started a large-scale counterfeiting operation. By 1888, Russo's counterfeiting gang had been rounded up and arrested. On October 26th, Russo would receive a sentence of 12 years in prison. With that, his partner, Candelaro Bettini, who was sentenced to 8 years in the same case, would have his cousin Niccolo Taranto take over the remnants of the former Russo gang. Taranto would take territories in Manhattan, with some of his subordinates taking territories in Brooklyn. In 1895, Bettini was released from prison and would go on to serve as underboss to his cousin. However, in January of 1896, Taranto, Bettini, and several other members of their gang would be arrested for counterfeiting, with all going on to be convicted. In April, the gang were sentenced, with Taranto and Bettini receiving 5 and 8 years respectively. Unlike the Russo gang, which was relatively small, the Taranto gang had almost full control of New York, and with the convictions of the highest-ranking members, there would be a massive power vacuum. Conveniently, this was around the time Giuseppe Morello arrived in New York and established a family of Corleonesi who would immediately begin their own counterfeiting operation. After 1896, it's more than likely the Taranto family was taken over by someone else. However, the identity of this leader has been completely lost to history. What is known is that there were several capos in the family who went on to work under Lupo. The 3 most notable were Antonio Cincotta, Pietro Inzerillo, and Saverio Verzi. By 1902, Lupo and Morello had been regularly collaborating in both their criminal and legitimate businesses. That year, the two would most likely team up to take over Manhattan's Little Italy, which was under the control of a Calabrian gang led by Giuseppe D'Agostino. After the two forced D'Agostino out, Lupo would use Little Italy as his main base of operations. Also during this time, Lupo would officially join forces with Morello in their counterfeiting operations. Lupo would have olive oil cans containing counterfeit bills imported from Sicily and sent to his grocery store on Mott Street. Once these bills arrived in New York, Lupo and Morello would have their soldiers distribute them. Lupo would also use his grocery stores to further consolidate his power. He would act as a wholesaler and force other grocery store owners to purchase items from him at a markup. If they refused, he would have their carts destroyed and their horses killed. Finally, during this time, Lupo would get involved in his most famous racket, Black Hand extortion. The Black Hand business entailed sending a threatening letter to a wealthy Italian businessman demanding money either under threat of death or destruction of property. For example, Lupo family capo Saverio Verzi would be arrested in 1908 for threatening to bomb a tenement building after a man who lived there ignored his letters and refused to pay him. Eventually, Lupo would turn this into a much more sophisticated operation with the help of Morello. The way this worked was, Lupo would have one of his subordinates send a Black Hand letter to an Italian businessman, then Morello would go to the man who was victimized and offer his services as a mediator between them and the extortionists. Morello would then tell the businessman that he was able to get the extortionist to agree to accept half of what they originally demanded. Once the man paid, the money would be split between the Morello and Lupo families. By July of 1902, Lupo had grown distrustful of one of his soldiers, Giuseppe Catania. Catania was a grocery store owner and was involved in Lupo and Morello's counterfeiting operation. He was also a heavy drinker who talked too much when drunk. Due to this, Lupo would decide to have him killed. He went to Morello and his underboss, Domenico Pecoraro, who both approved of the idea to have Catania murdered. One night, Lupo would lure Catania out under the pretense of retrieving stock from an importer's office. This was the last time Catania was ever seen alive. On the evening of July 23rd, his body would be discovered in the Bay Ridge neighborhood in Brooklyn, wrapped in a potato sack. His body appeared badly beaten and his throat had been cut deeply from ear to ear. The brutality of the Catania murder led to a lot of media coverage. However, despite this, no one from the Morello or Lupo families were arrested or even questioned regarding the murder. Months later, on December 31st, 3 men were arrested in Yonkers for selling counterfeit $5 bills. The 3 men were Giuseppe Giallombardo, Isidoro Crocevera, and Giuseppe Di Primo. While the 3 men were being held in the Ludlow Street jail, they would receive frequent visits from Lupo who helped to cover their legal expenses. On March 13, 1903, the 3 men would be found guilty and sentenced. Giallombardo was sentenced to 5 years, Di Primo was sentenced to 4 years, and Crocevera was sentenced to 3 years. Before the men were convicted and sent to prison, Giuseppe Di Primo's brother-in-law, Benedetto Madonia, sent Morello $1,000 to put towards his legal expenses. However, Morello pocketed the money. After the 3 men were convicted and Madonia found out about Morello taking his money, he would demand to meet with him. On April 13th, the meeting would take place at the Dolceria Pasticceria Cafe, owned by Lupo family capo Pietro Inzerillo. Morello and Madonia met in the back of the cafe and were accompanied by a few other men, including Morello's top enforcer, Tommaso the Ox Petto, and possibly Ignazio Lupo. During the meeting, Madonia criticized Morello for stealing his money and not looking out for his soldiers. While Madonia was facing Morello, Tommaso Petto would approach from behind and slash Madonia's throat. The body was then held over a sink where it was drained of blood before being stuffed into a barrel from the cafe. Supposedly, after the blood was drained from his body, his genitals were severed and stuffed in his mouth. Once Madonia's body was stuffed into the barrel, Morello would have the barrel dumped on East 11th Street. The barrel was more than likely transported using a cart sourced from store owner and Lupo family member, Giovanni Zarcone. Early the next day, a woman walking to work would stumble across the barrel, which was right in the middle of the street. As she removed the covering from the top, she was horrified to see the body of Madonia with his eyes wide open and his throat deeply cut. The woman immediately alerted the police and the body was taken to the morgue while the barrel was taken into evidence. The Madonia murder case would be handled by Lieutenant Joseph Petrosino and the Italian Squad, a division of the NYPD comprised of officers either of Italian descent or fluent in Italian who were initially given the responsibility of handling Black Hand extortion cases. Petrosino had memorized the faces of every Italian criminal in the city and was surprised when he couldn't recognize Madonia. Due to this, Petrosino would begin working diligently to identify the body. One of the things he did was visit Sing Sing prison to interview certain inmates, including Giuseppe De Primo. When Petrosino showed De Primo a picture of the body, De Primo identified it as being his brother-in-law from Buffalo named Benedetto Madonia. With that, Petrosino would work to trace Madonia's last movements. He would interview Madonia's wife and his stepson, Salvatore Sagliabene, both of whom pointed him in the direction of a secret society they believed Madonia to have been involved in. Eventually, Petrosino would trace Madonia to Morello and Lupo. It didn't help that they were also able to trace the barrel directly back to the cafe. By April 20th, Morello, Lupo, Pietro Inzerillo, and Tommaso Petto had been rounded up and arrested. In Petto's possession, police discovered a gold watch and pawn ticket, both of which were traceable to Madonia and identified by Salvatore Sagliabene. After the arrests were made, everyone arrested would be charged with murder. Soon after this, police would arrest Giovanni Zarcone for his involvement. However, Zarcone would be released soon after his arrest due to a lack of evidence. On April 22nd, the defendants would be taken to court where they were cross-examined and confronted with evidence. However, by this point, most potential witnesses had already recanted their statements. Due to this, on May 8th, all except Tommaso Petto were released. However, charges against Petto would be dropped on January 29, 1904, and he would also be released. Meanwhile, on December 23, 1903, Lupo would marry Morello's half-sister Salvatrice Terranova, with Morello having arranged the marriage in order to unify their families. Also during this time, Morello would establish the Ignazio Florio Cooperative. This company was established with the intention of capitalizing on the growing demand for affordable housing, which was fueled by the growing immigrant population in New York City. By 1904, Morello had built several tenement buildings, established an immigrant bank, and issued 50 shares worth around $24 each. Morello had established this company alongside his fellow Corleonesi, with shareholders including both legitimate and criminal businessmen. In 1907, Morello would pass down ownership of 2 tenement buildings located on the East 138th Street in the Bronx to Lupo, with another 2 neighboring tenement buildings being passed down to Pietro Inzerillo. Unfortunately, however, this company wouldn't thrive for much longer. By the end of 1907, the housing market in the city had become oversaturated, which greatly decreased the demand for housing. Due to this, Morello was having difficulty filling his tenement buildings. As well as this, in October, the New York Stock Exchange dropped by 50%. This was bad because most of the people who used Morello's immigrant bank began withdrawing their money out of fear the banks would soon fail. The main issue with this was that immigrant banks were not federally insured. With that, Morello had lost a significant amount of money. Due to this, he was unable to pay off his investors, resulting in threats of legal action from the legitimate shareholders and threats of death from the criminal shareholders. As a result of all this, Morello would once again turn to counterfeiting in order to make enough money to pay off his investors and financially recover from his failed real estate company. By 1908, Morello had secured the use of a farmhouse in the New York Highlands, which was owned by one of his capos, Salvatore Cina. Morello was also able to source printing presses from one of his associates from Corleone named Antonio Malone. This operation was partially funded by Lupo, who wasn't hit nearly as hard after the collapse of the cooperative. Finally, one of Morello's capos named Antonio Sacala would be able to recruit a young Calabrian immigrant named Antonio Comito to act as the printer for the counterfeit bills. Comito had experience working as a printer both in Calabria and America, with him being paid around $20 a week. While Morello's counterfeiting operation was running, Lupo would be approached with a proposition from his attorney, Philip Saietta. Saietta allegedly had the idea of defrauding the creditors who would lend stock and money to Lupo's stores. Saietta may have also proposed Lupo get his fellow mafiosi involved in order to expand the scheme. By November of 1908, Lupo had disappeared completely, having borrowed up to $500,000 in both stock and money from his various creditors, including a bank and an importer's office. Lupo, with the help of his crime family and Philip Saietta, would arrange to have the stock he borrowed shipped to Italy, where it could be sold. Meanwhile, while he was hiding out, Lupo would also pay a visit to the farmhouse where Antonio Comito was printing the counterfeit bills. On February 12, 1909, Lupo would meet with Antonio Cecala and Salvatore Cina at the farmhouse. When the three men were inside, Lupo would present them with bags full of guns and modified bullets to distribute to their soldiers. While the three men were together, Lupo would begin to discuss Lieutenant Joseph Petrosino. Lupo expressed his hatred for Petrosino to both men, recounting an incident that took place months earlier when Petrosino walked into his grocery store and punched him, knocking him to the ground. Aside from this, Petrosino was a frequent collaborator of the Secret Service and was hell-bent on taking down Italian criminals by any means necessary, whether through deportation or incarceration, with him being solely responsible for the 1907 deportation of Camorra leader Enrico Alfano. Due to all this, Lupo would approach Morello with the idea of having Petrosino killed. Initially, Morello was hesitant to support this idea as killing an NYPD lieutenant would almost certainly bring down a lot of additional law enforcement scrutiny, which would greatly affect their businesses. However, Morello would officially sanction the murder on February 21st, when Petrosino arrived in Sicily. Petrosino traveled to Sicily with the objective of obtaining criminal records of Sicilian mafiosi, who were operating in America in order to have them deported and prosecuted. By March, Morello's ally in Sicily, Don Vito Cascioferro, had been made aware of Petrosino's presence in Sicily and his intentions. Due to this, with the approval of Morello, Lupo, and Paolo Orlando, Cascioferro would order Petrosino's murder. On March 12th, two hitmen caught Petrosino walking down the Piazza Marina. The two men emerged from an alleyway and fired 4 shots into him, leaving him dead on the scene. Months after Petrosino was killed, in August, the Morello family would allow their printer, Antonio Comito, to leave the farmhouse for a few months, while their colorist, Morello family member Giuseppe Calicchio, took over as the printer. During this time, Comito would find a legitimate printing job in New York. Meanwhile, the Secret Service began receiving reports of counterfeit $2 and $5 bills circulating in banks around the country, with the highest concentration of these notes being reported in and around the New York tri-state area. Due to this, they would increase their surveillance of Giuseppe Morello, Ignazio Lupo, who they had trouble keeping tabs on due to the fact that he was hiding from his creditors, and several Morello family capos they suspected of being involved in counterfeiting. Eventually, by November, the Secret Service had observed several meetings between Antonio Cecala and a man named Salvatore Lucchino. Lucchino was a frequent buyer of counterfeit bills and always did business directly with Cecala. With that, the Secret Service arrested Lucchino and were able to get him to cooperate with them. On November 15, 1909, Cecala and Lucchino would meet up to do business like they usually did. However, the money Lucchino used to pay Cecala was comprised entirely of marked bills given to him by the Secret Service. After the exchange was made, Cecala was arrested and found in possession of the marked bills. Due to this and the months of surveillance, the Secret Service were able to get arrest warrants for Giuseppe Morello, Ignazio Lupo, Salvatore Cina, Cina's brother-in-law and co-owner of the farmhouse Vincenzo Giglio, Giuseppe Calicchio and Antonio Comito. That same day, all except Calicchio, Comito and Ignazio Lupo were arrested. However, Calicchio and Comito would be tracked down within a few days. When the two were arrested, Calicchio refused to cooperate. Comito, however, was ready to talk. Comito was able to implicate everyone who was arrested as he had met with Morello on a few occasions, and occasionally saw Lupo at the farmhouse. By 1910, everyone except Lupo was incarcerated and awaiting trial. However, on January 3rd, Lupo would be caught by police officers at a property in Brooklyn's Bath Beach section that he was renting under the name Mr. Presti. Lupo would be arrested after an unsuccessful attempt to bribe one of the arresting officers, and with that, Lupo was arraigned and put on trial alongside Morello and his other co-defendants. The trial would commence on January 26 with testimony from Antonio Comito. Comito would testify every day until February 2nd. After Comito's testimony concluded, the prosecution would bring forward several other witnesses, including a man who sold printing presses to one of Morello's associates. On February 15th, the defense would bring forth several character witnesses, including Giuseppe Morello's half-brothers Niccolo Ciro and Vincenzo Terranova, and Lupo's younger brother Giovanni. The next day, on the 16th, Lupo himself would be called to testify in his defense. Lupo would tell his entire life story, including his having to flee Sicily after committing a murder in self-defense. Unfortunately, this would all be in vain, as on February 19th, after an hour and 15 minutes of deliberation, the jury would return with guilty verdicts for all defendants. That same day, sentences would be handed down. Lupo was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison, Morello was sentenced to 25 years, Colicchio was sentenced to 17 years, Cicala, Sina, and Giglio were sentenced to 15 years, and two other defendants, Giuseppe Palermo and Niccolo Silvestro, were sentenced to 18 and 15 years respectively. Interestingly, Lupo would never be charged for his participation in the scheme to defraud his creditors. However, his attorney Philip Saietta would be disbarred for his involvement. Meanwhile, back on the streets, Morello and Lupo's families would need to be taken over by acting bosses while their cases were being reviewed. Lupo's family would be taken over by his brother Giovanni, and Morello's family would be taken over by Giovanni Pecoraro. However, in 1912, their appeals failed. Due to this, their families would be taken over by permanent bosses. Lupo's family would be officially taken over by Salvatore d'Aquila, and Morello's family would be officially taken over by Fortunato Lamonte. With that, Morello and Lupo were set to grow old in prison. However, things wouldn't necessarily work out that way. Tommy Gagliano was born Tommaso Gagliano on May 29, 1883, in Corleone, Sicily, to parents Luciano Gagliano and Lucia Oliveri. Tommaso had 5 sisters with only 2 surviving infancy. Sometime in the spring of 1905, Gagliano would arrive in New York City, possibly settling on First Avenue in East Harlem, Upper Manhattan. When Gagliano arrived in New York, the area in which he settled was under the control of the Morello crime family, one of 3 Sicilian families active in the city. The Morello family was also comprised mostly of men from Corleone and some of the surrounding regions. It's possible that Gagliano became associated with the Morello family through a faction led by Ippolito Greco and Angelo Gagliano. Despite sharing the same last name, Angelo and his brother Vincenzo were of no direct relation to Tommaso Gagliano. One of Gagliano's early associates was Morello family member Mariano Marsalisi. Marsalisi arrived in New York from Corleone the same year as Gagliano, with him settling at the corner of East 108th Street and 2nd Avenue. Also during this time, Gagliano may have had his own feed store business in or around East 107th Street. In February of 1910, the boss of the Morello family, Giuseppe Morello, would be sentenced to 25 years in federal prison for running a large-scale counterfeiting operation alongside some of his capos and the boss of the Palermitani family, Ignazio Lupo. Due to this, the family would change hands with Giovanni Pecoraro taking over as acting boss. Morello also held the title of Boss of Bosses, which would go to Castellamarese family boss, Sebastiano Di Gaetano. However, in 1912, after Morello and Lupo's appeals failed, and it became clear that they would remain in prison for the foreseeable future, their families would be appointed permanent bosses. Fortunato Lamonte would take over as boss of the Morello family, and Salvatore d'Aquila would take over as boss of the Lupo family. D'Aquila was also officially elected to the position of Boss of Bosses. In 1914, Ippolito Greco would get involved in a conspiracy to murder Jewish poultry dealer Barnett Baff. Greco was contacted by a middleman named Antonio Cardinale, who represented some of Baff's rival poultry dealers, including a man named Joseph Cohen. Cardinale was given the task of hiring the hitmen on behalf of Cohen and his associates, which is how he found Ippolito Greco. On November 24th, Baff would be gunned down at the West Washington Market in Lower Manhattan by 2 Sicilian gunmen working under Greco. However, less than a year after he facilitated the murder of Baff, Greco himself would be killed. On October 7, 1915, Ippolito Greco was walking down East 108th Street with his brother and a few of his associates, when unknown gunmen approached from behind and fired at him with automatic revolvers. Greco was hit with 15 bullets and died instantly. It wasn't until 1916, with the arrest of Carmine Di Paolo, who was a small-time criminal from the Bronx, that police would get their first leads on who killed Baff. Di Paolo told police that he was approached by Ippolito Greco and offered the job of killing Baff. Di Paolo would implicate several people he claimed were involved in the murder, including a man named Francesco Ferrara. When Ferrara was arrested, he would claim to have acted as the getaway driver for the gunmen. By the time Ferrara was arrested, police had already arrested Giuseppe Arciello, who they were confident was one of the gunmen. Due to this, police would question Ferrara regarding the identity of the other gunmen. Ferrara would ultimately name Gagliano's future boss, Gaetano Reina. Ferrara claimed Reina was an enforcer working under Greco, and Reina would be arrested on February 28th. Despite having identified him, Ferrara would soon after claim that Reina wasn't one of the gunmen, going on to implicate Ignazio Jack Dragna instead. Due to this, Reina would be released and Dragna would be arrested in Los Angeles and extradited to New York. However, before the trial started, Dragna would be released due to a lack of evidence. After the Bath murder took place, Antonio Cardinale fled to Italy. However, he would be extradited back to the US when he was implicated in the murder. When police questioned him, he implicated Joseph Cohen and a few other Jewish poultry dealers as having been the masterminds behind the Bath murder. Due to this, in 1917, Cohen would be tried, convicted, and sentenced to death for the murder of Barnett Bath. In April of 1916, Giuseppe Archiello was also given a death sentence. However, he would be given a new trial and was acquitted in 1917. With the 1915 murder of Ippolito Greco, his crew would be taken over by Gaetano Reina. Also, during this time, the Morello family would once again change hands. In 1914, Fortunato Lomonte was murdered by a hitman working under Salvatore D'Aquila. After Fortunato's death, his brother Tommaso Lomonte would be made boss of the Morello family. However, in 1915, Tommaso Lomonte himself would be gunned down. After the murders of the Lomonte brothers, D'Aquila would back Salvatore Loiacano to take over the Morello crime family. By this time, Gagliano had more than likely become acquainted with Gaetano Reina, who was now a capo in the Morello family under Loiacano. During his time as a capo, Reina would take control of the ice distribution business in Harlem. This business was incredibly lucrative in a time before electric refrigerators were common in average households. The next 5 years were a relatively peaceful time within the family. Reina would continue to expand his businesses with Gagliano by his side. However, in 1920, everything would change. By the end of the year, the original boss of the family, Giuseppe Morello, was nearing his parole date. Due to this, he began making arrangements to take back control of the family. The first thing he did was arrange to meet with a representative of his closest ally, Giovanni Pecoraro. Through this meeting, Morello communicated to Pecoraro that Salvatore Loiacano would need to step down as boss of the family. However, when this got back to Loiacano, he adamantly refused. As a result, on December 10th, Loiacano would be shot and killed by a hitman working under Morello who walked into his restaurant in Lower Manhattan and shot him twice. After Loiacano was killed, the Morello family would split off into two separate families. The family loyal to Loiacano and Salvatore D'Aquila was led by Gaetano Reina, and the family loyal to Morello was led by Morello's half-brother, Vincenzo Terranova. Also, upon the murder of Loiacano, 6 of his loyalists made it clear that they intended on avenging him. Due to this, Morello hired out the services of Castellammarese family boss, Niccolo Sciro's enforcement arm known as the Good Killers. On December 29th, Loiacano's closest ally, Salvatore Mauro, was caught on Christie Street and shot once from behind, dropping him instantly. While Mauro was on the ground, the gunman would fire another shot into him, killing him instantly. On January 23, 1921, another Loiacano ally would be killed. On this day, Angelo Patricola was walking down Elizabeth Street when a gunman approached from behind and shot him 3 times in the back, leaving him dead in the street. On February 1st, an attempt would be made on the life of Loiacano loyalist Angelo Lagatuta. Lagatuta was shot and wounded alongside his associate, Saverio Sampolaccia. The 2 men were caught by a gunman while walking in the Bronx. Finally, on February 28th, Giuseppe Granatelli would be caught on Christie Street and shot twice with a sawn-off shotgun, killing him instantly. After the murder of Granatelli, who was the last Loiacano ally to be murdered, Salvatore D'Aquila would condemn Morello to death, officially placing a contract on his head. D'Aquila would also condemn his former boss, Ignazio Lupo, who was Morello's brother-in-law and one of his closest allies. Due to this, Morello and D'Aquila went to war, sparking what was known as the Second Mafia War. Meanwhile, Reina would begin adapting to running a family. Reina's family was mainly comprised of original, more conservative Morello family members who had no significant loyalties to Morello. Naturally, Tommaso Gagliano would join Reina and was appointed to the position of underboss soon after. Other members to join Reina's organization were Stefano LaSalle, who was a very influential member of the Morello family, with him maintaining complete control of the Harlem Numbers business, and Mariano Marsalisi, who was a close associate of Gagliano, an early member of the Morello family. Reina would also move his operations to the Bronx, taking control of the ice distribution business there, and buying a house at 3183 Rochambeau Avenue. As for Gagliano, he would remain in Manhattan for the time being. On October 23, 1921, Gagliano would marry Giuseppa Pomilla, the sister of his associate Nunzio Pomilla. Also, by 1921, Gagliano had officially changed his occupation from grain store owner to contractor. He most likely did this because he and his now brother-in-law, Nunzio Pomilla, were in the early stages of establishing the United Lathing Company. 1923, after several murders on both sides, Morello and D'Aquila would reach a peace agreement. During the war, Morello's half-brother Vincenzo Terranova was killed. Due to this, Morello's family was now under the control of Giuseppe Joe Masseria. Even though Reina's family were loyal to D'Aquila, it appears Reina kept out of the conflict completely. Reina was in a great position during this time, as he had almost full control of the ice distribution business in New York, and was almost certainly profiting from prohibition. As well as this, Gagliano's United Lathing Company was fully up and running. The company hired legitimate lathers and plasterers, all while running a large-scale extortion operation. Gagliano had contacts including a union delegate named Michael McCluskey, who represented one of the most prominent building unions in the city. As well as this, Gagliano had several contractors on side. These contractors would be backed by the company to bid on construction contracts. In exchange for this, the contractors would need to pay a small percentage of the contract value to Gagliano and the United Lathing Company. These contractors would also need to employ a certain amount of the company's workers in their projects. Meanwhile, by the mid-1920s, Reina had switched his allegiance from D'Aquila to Masseria after it became clear that D'Aquila had lost a significant amount of power, having been overpowered by Masseria and his underboss, Giuseppe Morello. Due to the alliance between the Reina and Masseria families, Giuseppe Morello would be made a shareholder in the United Lathing Company. By 1928, Masseria and Morello had reached the peak of their power. Due to this, they would arrange to have Salvatore D'Aquila killed so Masseria could officially take the title of Boss of Bosses. By October, Masseria and Morello had gotten D'Aquila's underboss, Manfredi Mineo, on their side. The two men promised Mineo that they would back him to succeed D'Aquila as boss of his family if he were to arrange D'Aquila's murder. Mineo agreed to this, and on October 10th, Salvatore D'Aquila would be caught on Avenue A in Manhattan and shot to death by 3 enforcers working under Mineo. Immediately after the murder of D'Aquila, Masseria would be elected the new boss of bosses. As well as this, Mineo would officially be named boss of the former D'Aquila family by Masseria. Over the next year, Masseria would begin to lose the support of some of the families, including the Reina family. Masseria became a tyrannical boss of bosses and began to demand tribute from the families. In Reina's case, he attempted to take a percentage of his ice distribution business. Due to this, when Castellamarese family boss, Salvatore Maranzano, began garnering support from the other families to take on Masseria, Reina was the first one he got on side. However, although Reina only privately gave Maranzano his support, Masseria would eventually be made aware of Reina's defection to Maranzano's side. By February of 1930, Masseria had been made aware of Reina's defection to Maranzano's side. Due to this, Masseria would decide to have Reina murdered. Masseria gave this task to one of his most powerful capos, Charles Lucky Luciano. Luciano would then delegate Reina's murder to his soldier and top enforcer, Vito Genovese. On February 26th, Reina was leaving his girlfriend's house on Sheridan Avenue in the Bronx. Reina was walking with his girlfriend to a car that was parked outside of her apartment building. Just as Reina opened the door for his girlfriend, Vito Genovese and an accomplice approached. Genovese fired 3 shots from a shotgun into Reina's chest, dropping him to the ground. Genovese and his accomplice fled and Reina was taken to hospital, where he was pronounced dead. After Reina was killed, Masseria and Maranzano would officially go to war, sparking one of the most violent conflicts in Mafia history. Also after Reina was murdered, Masseria would appoint his friend Joseph Pinzolo to the position of boss of the former Reina family. This particularly outraged Tommaso Gagliano, who felt he was Reina's natural successor as boss of the family. Due to this, Gagliano, alongside powerful family capo, Gaetano Tommy Lucchese, assembled a rebellious faction comprised of Reina loyalists who silently opposed Pinzolo. This faction was comprised of Gagliano, Lucchese, soldier Stefano Ranelli, soldier Giro Lamo Santucci, soldier Dominic the Gap Petrelli, and family associate Joe Velacci. This faction of the family weren't prepared to actually make a move on Pinzolo until August 15th. On this day, Salvatore Maranzano's top enforcer, Sebastiano Buster from Chicago Domingo, was driven by Joe Velacci to the East Harlem office of Masseria's underboss, Giuseppe Morello. When Velacci pulled up outside 352 East 116th Street, Domingo rushed in and shot Morello to death. The murder of Giuseppe Morello absolutely crippled the Masseria family, as Morello was considered the brains and strategy behind Masseria. Due to this, Gagliano and Lucchese saw this as the perfect opportunity to arrange the murder of their family boss, Joseph Pinzolo. On September 5th, Pinzolo was in an office, leased by Tommy Lucchese at an office building on Broadway in Midtown Manhattan when Girolamo Santucci walked in. Santucci caught Pinzolo completely unguarded and shot him 3 times with a .32 caliber revolver, leaving him dead on the scene. After Pinzolo's murder, Gagliano would be called to a meeting with Masseria, who wanted to determine whether Gagliano was responsible for Pinzolo's death. During this meeting, Gagliano told Masseria that he had no involvement in Pinzolo's murder and he was also looking for whoever killed him. Masseria was satisfied with this and officially allowed Gagliano to take over as boss of the former Reina family. Masseria likely believed Gagliano was on side with him. However, he was wrong. When Gagliano was made boss, he fully defected to Maranzano's side. As well as this, Gagliano was actively funding Maranzano's side, providing guns, soldiers, and money to help him. Eventually, on November 5th, the war would completely turn in Maranzano's favor. On this day, Masseria's last remaining ally, Manfredi Mineo, and his underboss, Steve Ferrigno, were gunned down outside Ferrigno's apartment building in Pelham Parkway in the Bronx. The shooters were Buster from Chicago and Giro Lamo Santucci, with Joe Velacci having rented out an apartment that was used to keep tabs on Mineo and Ferrigno. After the murder of Mineo, Maranzano would appoint Frank Scalise to the position of boss of the Mineo family. By April of 1931, Masseria's now underboss, Charlie Luciano, was prepared to reach out to Maranzano in order to make a deal. Ultimately, Luciano would offer to arrange the murder of Masseria on the condition he be made boss of his family. Maranzano agreed to this, and on April 15th, Masseria would be gunned down at a restaurant on Coney Island in Brooklyn. From this point, Salvatore Maranzano was now the official boss of all bosses, and Luciano was now the boss of the former Masseria family. And although things were running smoothly, this wouldn't last for long. Maranzano began to grow weary of Luciano's ambition and never fully trusted him. Eventually, Maranzano would put things in place to have Luciano and his closest allies murdered. Maranzano hired Irish gangster Vincent Mad Dog Cole to kill Luciano, his underboss Vito Genovese, and his consigliere Frank Costello. Maranzano would also order Frank Scalise to arrange the murder of a capo in his family, Vincent Mangano. However, none of these murders would be carried out. During this time, the Gagliano family was close with Maranzano. Due to this, Gagliano's now underboss, Tommy Lucchese, who was an old friend of Luciano's, would be able to warn him of Maranzano's intentions. As well as this, Frank Scalise wasn't able to carry out the murder of Mangano, resulting in Maranzano growing suspicious of him. When Scalise believed that Maranzano would eventually order his murder, he would defect to Luciano's side, telling him everything and corroborating Lucchese's information. On September 10th, Luciano would act first. On this day, several Jewish hitmen dressed as IRS agents walked into Maranzano's office at the New York Central building and stabbed him multiple times before shooting him to death. These hitmen were most likely provided by Luciano's close friend, Meyer Lansky. After the death of Maranzano, Luciano organized the Commission, a governing body made up of the 5 New York families, as well as Buffalo and Chicago, that oversaw and regulated activities throughout the country. Luciano allowed Tommaso Gagliano to remain boss of the former Reina family with Tommy Lucchese as his underboss. Giuseppe Joe Profaci remained boss of his own family, and Luciano remained boss of the former Masseria family, with Vito Genovese as his underboss and Frank Costello as his consigliere. However, Luciano would replace Frank Scalise with Vincent Mangano as boss of the former D'Aquila family, with Luciano appointing his friend Albert Anastasia to the position of underboss. Finally, Luciano would appoint Giuseppe Joe bonanno to the position of boss of the former Maranzano family. From this point, Gagliano kept a very low profile as boss. However, he would soon be faced with legal troubles. In March of 1932, Gagliano would be indicted alongside several shareholders in the United Lathing Company on federal tax evasion charges. The United States Treasury Department estimated that Gagliano and his associates extorted over $1 million from the construction industry since the company was established in the early 1920s. Meanwhile, while Gagliano was on bail, former Reina family associate and current Luciano family soldier Joe Velacci would marry Gaetano Reina's daughter Carmela. Gagliano would attend the wedding alongside Tommy Lucchese. Shortly after Gagliano attended the wedding, he would turn himself in to serve a 1-year and 3-month sentence for tax evasion, with him having been convicted earlier in the year. Gagliano would be released from prison in 1933. A few years after his release, the commission would be faced with its first major challenge. In 1935, New York District Attorney Thomas E. Dewey would begin a crusade against organized crime in the city. His first target was Jewish gangster Dutch Schultz. Schultz would be tried by Dewey for tax evasion twice, with both trials resulting in mistrials. Eventually, Schultz approached the commission with the idea of having Dewey killed. The commission shut this idea down almost instantly, resulting in Schultz deciding to have Dewey killed himself. When this got back to the commission, they would decide to have Schultz killed, with his murder being carried out on October 24th. However, after the murder of Schultz, Dewey would set his sights on Luciano. In early 1936, Luciano would be indicted on charges of compulsory prostitution. On June 7th, he was found guilty on 62 counts, going on to receive a sentence of 30 to 50 years in prison. Once Luciano was sent to prison, his family would be taken over by Vito Genovese. However, Genovese was forced to flee to Italy in 1937 after being indicted on a murder charge. Due to this, the Luciano family would be taken over by Frank Costello. From this point, Tommaso Gagliano kept an incredibly low profile. Joe Bonanno would later write in his autobiography that Gagliano was a boss with very conservative views, comparing him to fellow bosses Stefano Magaddino and Vincent Mangano, who were also considered to have conservative views. At some point, Gagliano would give Tommy Lucchese more responsibilities, allowing him to drop off the radar completely. In 1946, Luciano was paroled and deported to Italy. That same year, Genovese would be extradited from Italy to the US to face trial for murder, with him receiving an acquittal the next year. On February 16, 1951, Tommaso Gagliano quietly passed away at his home in the Bronx. Gagliano would be succeeded as boss of his family by Tommy Lucchese, who headed the family until his own death in 1967. Albert Anastasia was born Umberto Anastasio on September 26, 1902 in Tropea, Calabria. He had 7 brothers and 1 sister. In 1917, when he was 15, Anastasia, alongside his brothers Giuseppe, Anthony and Gerardo, deserted a ship they were working on at the port of New York. From this point, they would work on the Brooklyn docks as longshoremen. Eventually, Anastasia would partner up with another young Calabrian longshoreman named Giuseppe Florino. Together, Anastasia and Florino would extort dock workers and steal items from shipments. On May 17, 1920, Anastasia and Florino would get into a heated argument with another longshoreman named George Torino. This argument would escalate and Torino would be shot and killed. After a police investigation, Florino would be arrested in New York, with Anastasia being caught later in Rhode Island. On May 15, 1921, Anastasia and Florino would be convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death, with both scheduled to be executed in the electric chair in Sing Sing prison on July 3rd. However, their executions would never be carried out. Their execution date would be delayed due to an appeal, with the two eventually getting a new trial. In 1922, Anastasia and Florino would be acquitted on the original charges, as the main witness tying them to the murder was deemed unreliable due to her prior relationship with Florino. Upon their release from prison, Anastasia and Florino would go back to exerting their control over the Brooklyn waterfront. By 1923, the two had been noticed by members of the D'Aquila crime family. The D'Aquila family, led by Salvatore D'Aquila, was one of 4 Sicilian crime families active in New York. At this time, it was also the most powerful, as D'Aquila was the boss of all bosses. Despite being mainly Sicilian, the family had a Calabrian faction, likely led by Baggio Giordano. Giordano was a bootlegger and former blackhander who would take Anastasia and Florino under his wing, using them as enforcers. Around the time Anastasia and Florino became affiliated with Giordano, there was an internal war going on within the family. Calabrian members of the family were engaged in a war with Palermitani members. On April 7, 1923, Palermitani leader Vincenzo Bussardo would be caught on the corner of DeGraw and Columbia Streets in Brooklyn by Anastasia and Florino. Anastasia would shoot Bussardo 4 times in the back, dropping him instantly. He would be taken to hospital, where he would die later that same day. Before he died, Bussardo would implicate Anastasia and Florino in his shooting. As a result, they would both be arrested and held without bail for the murder. Later, both would be released due to a lack of evidence. On April 28th, 3 weeks after the murder of Bussardo, Albert Anastasia and Baggio Giordano were driving down Sackett Street in Brooklyn when their car was riddled with bullets. Anastasia would sustain minor injuries. Giordano, however, was hit multiple times and would later die in hospital. On June 6th, Anastasia and Florino would be arrested for the illegal possession of handguns. Both would be sentenced on July 14th to 3 years in prison. On December 3rd, arrests would be made in connection to the murder of Giordano. 9 D'Aquila family members, including former boss Ignazio Lupo, were arrested in a restaurant at 219 Columbia Street in Brooklyn. They would all be charged with being involved in the murder. 3 days later, Lupo and 6 others were released due to a lack of substantial evidence tying them to the murder, with the other 2 being released shortly after. Lupo and the others were holding a meeting when they were arrested. Some of the attendees were Calabrian gangster Carmelo Liconti and Lupo's cousin Salvatore Lupo. Liconti's presence possibly suggests that Lupo had organized the meeting in order to broker a truce between the Calabrian and Palermitani factions of the family. By 1926, Anastasia and Florino had been released from prison. On July 21, 1926, Carmine Cenatiempo would be gunned down by Anastasia associates. Cenatiempo was a gangster who had done time in Sing Sing prison for assault and robbery and had a great deal of power and influence on the Brooklyn docks. It's likely he had tried to rebel against Anastasia and the faction of the D'Aquila family that controlled the waterfront. By 1928, Salvatore D'Aquila's power as boss of bosses had significantly decreased. During this time, his power was being challenged by another New York crime boss, Giuseppe Joe, the boss Masseria. Masseria and his underboss, Giuseppe Morello, had been waiting for years to make a move on D'Aquila, and they would get their chance when D'Aquila's underboss, Manfredi Mineo, defected to their side. On October 10, 1928, D'Aquila would be caught on Avenue 8 in Manhattan by 3 men working under Mineo. One of the men would fire 4 bullets into D'Aquila, leaving him dead on the scene. From this point, Masseria would be appointed to the position of boss of bosses by the families. Immediately after the murder of D'Aquila, Masseria would back Manfredi Mineo to succeed D'Aquila as boss of the family. Around this time, Anastasia would form alliances with Masseria family members Giuseppe Joe, Adonis Dotto, Guarino Willie Moretti, Frank Costello, and even powerful Masseria family capo, Charles Lucky Luciano. During Masseria's reign as boss of bosses, he would use his position to demand tribute from the families and even implement leadership changes throughout the country. This led to some of the bosses growing disillusioned with his reign. By the end of 1929, Castellamarese family boss, Salvatore Maranzano, had decided to capitalize on this in order to take the position for himself. The first family he properly got on side was the Reina family. When Masseria was made aware of Gaetano Reina's defection, he would order him to be killed, entrusting Charlie Luciano with having this carried out. On February 26, 1930, Reina would be gunned down on Sheridan Avenue in the Bronx by Luciano's top enforcer, Vito Genovese. This would kickstart a war between Masseria and Maranzano. Throughout 1930, Maranzano would eliminate several key Masseria allies. On August 15th, Masseria's underboss, Giuseppe Morello, would be gunned down in his East Harlem office. On September 5th, Joseph Pinzolo, the Masseria-appointed boss of the Reina family, would be gunned down by members of the family who were loyal to Reina's underboss, Tommaso Gagliano. Finally, on November 5th, the boss of the former D'Aquila family, Manfredi Mineo, would be gunned down outside an apartment building in Pelham Parkway in the Bronx. After the murder of Mineo, the family would be taken over by Frank Scalise. Scalise was a high-ranking member of the family's Sicilian faction and a Maranzano loyalist. By 1931, Joe Masseria had lost most of his power and was now the boss of bosses in name alone. Seeing this, Masseria's underboss, Charlie Luciano, would decide to reach out to Maranzano in order to make a deal. Luciano would agree to have Masseria killed, with his murder being carried out on April 15th at a restaurant on Coney Island in Brooklyn. After this, Maranzano would officially become the undisputed boss of all bosses. Also immediately after the murder of Masseria, Luciano would take over as boss of his family. Luciano would appoint Vito Genovese to the position of underboss and Frank Costello to the position of consigliere. From this point, everything appeared to be running smoothly. However, Luciano was quietly biding his time. He would spend the next few months garnering support from the other families to make his next move. Luciano had the idea to remove the position of boss of bosses altogether and form the Commission, a governing body made up of the 5 New York families that would oversee every family in the United States. Maranzano was also working against Luciano. He would begin to grow distrustful of Luciano and his allies, mainly due to their willingness to work with non-Italians like Meyer Lansky and Louis Lepke Buchalter. Eventually, Maranzano would order Luciano and his allies to be killed, hiring Irish gangster Vincent Mad Dog Cole to kill them. Luciano would be made aware of this through the intervention of his old friend, Tommy Lucchese. Lucchese was the underboss to Tommaso Gagliano, the boss of the former Reina family. Lucchese and Gagliano were also very close to Maranzano and his family, allowing Lucchese to warn Luciano of Maranzano's plans. Tommy Lucchese's information would be corroborated by Frank Scalise. Scalise had defected to Luciano's side after he was ordered by Maranzano to kill Luciano ally Vincent Mangano. As a result of all this, Luciano would put things in place to have Maranzano killed. On September 10, 1931, Luciano would send 4 Jewish hitmen dressed as IRS agents to Maranzano's office in the New York Central Building in Manhattan. The 4 hitmen provided by Meyer Lansky would stab Maranzano multiple times before shooting him to death. After the death of Maranzano, Luciano would finally be able to form the commission. He would get rid of the position of boss of bosses and make some leadership changes. He would allow Maranzano's protege, Joe Bonanno, to take over the Maranzano family. Tommaso Gagliano would remain boss of the former Reina family. Joe Profaci would remain boss of his own family. And finally, Luciano would appoint Vincent Mangano to replace Scalise as boss of the former D'Aquila family. Luciano would also appoint Albert Anastasia to the position of underboss of the now Mangano crime family. Initially, Anastasia and Mangano worked well together, with Anastasia controlling the Brooklyn waterfront for the family. In 1932, Anthony Anastasio would take control of the Brooklyn Local 1814 of the International Longshoremen's Association, one of the most prominent labor unions representing Brooklyn dock workers. Also around this time, Anastasia would become acquainted with Jewish mob boss Louis Lepke Buckhalter. Lepke was one of the most powerful industrial racketeers in New York at this time, maintaining his control over labor unions and the garment industry using a team of Jewish and Italian enforcers working under him. Lepke was also the boss of the most powerful Jewish criminal organization in New York after he gunned down the previous boss, Jacob Little Olgi Orgin, in 1927. Anastasia would eventually be able to enlist the services of Lepke's enforcers on behalf of the commission. By 1934, New York District Attorney Thomas Dewey had waged a campaign against organized crime in the city. His first target was Dutch Schultz. Schultz was a very powerful Jewish gangster with an organization that controlled the numbers business and the distribution of beer in the Bronx and Harlem during Prohibition. Schultz would be tried by Dewey for tax evasion twice, both times receiving acquittals. This led to a heavy law enforcement crackdown that forced Schultz to relocate to New Jersey. Due to this, he would decide to have Thomas Dewey killed. In 1935, Schultz would approach the commission with this idea. Anastasia was initially supportive of this idea. However, the commission would unanimously rule against it, with Anastasia siding with the commission. Luciano would tell Schultz that the murder of Dewey would result in a major crackdown on organized crime, deeming it to be more trouble than it was worth. Despite this, Schultz would decide to go against the commission and have Dewey killed himself. Upon finding out about this, the commission would decide to have Schultz killed, delegating the task to Anastasia. Anastasia would go to Lepke for the hitmen, with the job being given to 2 of his top enforcers, Charles the Bug Workman and Emmanuel Mendy Weiss. On October 23, 1935, Schultz was at a restaurant on East Park Street in New Jersey with 3 others, including his personal bodyguard, Bernard Lulu Rosenkrantz. While Schultz was in the bathroom, the 2 Lepke hitmen would enter the restaurant and shoot all 4 men present, with all later succumbing to their gunshot wounds. From this point, Anastasia would be the main link between the commission and Lepke, mostly using his enforcers for his own purposes, or occasionally at the behest of the other families. In 1936, after Schultz was taken out, Thomas Dewey would set his sights on Charlie Luciano. Dewey would indict Luciano on 62 counts of enforced prostitution. Luciano would be convicted on all charges, receiving a sentence of 30 to 50 years in prison on June 18th. From this point, the Luciano crime family would be taken over by his underboss, Vito Genovese. However, Genovese would flee to Italy in 1937 due to him being indicted on a murder charge stemming from the 1934 shooting death of Ferdinand Boccia. After Genovese fled the country, the family would be taken over by Anastasia's close associate, Frank Costello. Shortly after Luciano was convicted, Louis Lepke Buckhalter would be convicted on 4 counts of violating federal antitrust laws stemming from his extortion of the rabbit fur industry. Lepke would be convicted alongside his criminal partner, Jacob Gura Shapiro. While on bail, awaiting sentencing, both men would decide to go on the run. While he was a fugitive, Lepke would be indicted on federal narcotics charges in late 1937. On April 14, 1938, Shapiro would turn himself in and would be sentenced to serve 2 years in federal prison for the conviction he received in 1936. During Lepke's time on the run, Anastasia would help him evade law enforcement and would assist him in keeping his organization running. In May of 1939, Anastasia would have union official Morris Diamond killed in order to help Lepke maintain his control of the garment industry. Anastasia would also continue to use Lepke's enforcers to further his own family's interests. In July of 1939, Anastasia would order Mendy Weiss and 2 other Lepke enforcers to kill longshoreman Peter Pano. Panto had assembled several other Brooklyn dockworkers to protest the Mangano family's control of the International Longshoremen's Association. On July 14th, Panto would disappear completely. In August of 1939, Vincent Mangano would order Anastasia to arrange the murder of Irving Puggy Feinstein. Feinstein was running a gambling operation in Mangano's territory and refused to pay tribute to the Mangano family. Anastasia would then delegate this task to one of Lepke's enforcers, Harry Pittsburgh Phil Strauss. On September 5th, Strauss, alongside two other Lepke hitmen, Abe Kid Twist Rellas and Martin Bugsy Goldstein, would kidnap Feinstein and take him to Rellas' house on East 91st Street in Brooklyn. There, they would tie a rope around his neck while Strauss hacked him to death with an ice pick. Later, they would take the body to a vacant lot where it was burned. Also around this time, Lepke would be convinced by Anastasia to turn himself in to the FBI to serve a 14-year sentence for narcotics trafficking. The reason for this was that the commission was facing increasing scrutiny from both federal and state authorities as a result of Lepke eluding them. In February of 1940, Abe Rellas would be arrested and charged with several crimes, including murder. Realizing that he was likely going to be convicted and given a death sentence, he would turn state's witness and would provide information on everyone he knew. Rellas would implicate Lepke, Strauss, Goldstein, Charles Workman, Mendy Weiss, and many other Lepke enforcers in various murders. Rellas would also implicate Anastasia in the murders of Peter Panto and Irving Feinstein. When Rells agreed to testify, he would be moved from the jail to the Half Moon Hotel on Coney Island in Brooklyn. Also in 1940, Lepke would be indicted on 14 state charges relating to union extortion. On April 5th, he would receive a sentence of 30 years to life in prison. In March, Charles Workman would be indicted on charges stemming from the 1935 murder of Dutch Schultz. He would plead guilty in order to avoid the death penalty, receiving a sentence of life in prison. In September, Harry Strauss and Martin Goldstein would stand trial for the 1939 murder of Irving Feinstein. Rellas was the main witness in this trial, and his testimony would result in both being convicted on September 19th. On the 26th, Strauss and Goldstein would both be sentenced to death. On June 12, 1941, after an unsuccessful appeal, both men would be executed in the electric chair in Sing Sing prison. In May of 1941, Lepke, who was serving a combined 44 years in prison, would be charged with ordering the 1936 murder of a former union official named Joseph Rosen. Lepke would be charged alongside Mendy Weiss and another one of his enforcers, Louis Capone. In October, the trial would officially start. Rellas gave information regarding the Rosen murder to detectives when he was first arrested, and his information would be corroborated by Albert TikTok Tannenbaum, who testified at the trial. During the trial of Lepke and his two enforcers, Abe Rellas was set to further implicate Albert Anastasia. However, he would never get the chance to testify to anything. On November 12th, Rellas, who was staying on the 6th floor of the Half Moon Hotel, would seemingly try to escape. Using a sheet rope, he would be able to lower himself from the 6th to the 5th floor before the rope became undone, and he plummeted to his death. The 5 NYPD officers guarding him would discover the sheet rope hanging out of a window, discovering his body on a 2nd floor landing shortly after. It's often alleged that Anastasia's close associate, Frank Costello, paid the guards to kill Rellas before he could testify in court. Costello also had a close relationship with the district attorney in charge of the murder trials, William O'Dwyer, possibly explaining why Anastasia wasn't initially indicted. As for Lepke and his enforcers, their trial would conclude on November 30th, with all 3 defendants receiving guilty verdicts. On December 10th, all 3 would be sentenced to death. On March 4th, 1944, after several appeals, Lepke, Capone, and Weiss would all be executed in the electric chair in Sing Sing prison. By 1942, Charlie Luciano had figured out a way to get his sentence commuted. This was right in the middle of the Second World War, and Luciano had an idea of how to help with the war effort and ultimately secure his release. Luciano would make a deal with the US military in which he would call upon Anastasia to secure the waterfront. Also, he was able to use his connections in southern Italy to assist the Allied forces in their invasion of Italy, which was controlled by Benito Mussolini and his fascist government. The conditions of their deal were that Luciano would be transferred to a prison with better conditions and at the end of the war would be released. During this time, Luciano was frequently visited by Frank Costello and Meyer Lansky, with Costello relaying messages from Luciano to Anastasia. Meanwhile, Vito Genovese, who was still in Italy, was a supporter of Mussolini. Their alliance began when Genovese fled to Italy in 1937. From this point, he would donate large amounts of money to Mussolini's fascist government and even grow close to Mussolini's son-in-law. On July 9, 1943, the Allies would successfully invade Sicily, and later on September 3rd would successfully invade mainland Italy through Calabria. The Allied forces would also manage to recruit many Italian soldiers to their side, giving them a greater advantage. 2 months earlier, Mussolini had been dismissed as Prime Minister of Italy after the Italian Parliament vote to have him removed from his position and arrested. Sometime after the Allied invasion, the Germans would invade the northern and central regions of Italy. As a result, they were able to free Mussolini and transport him to Germany. Vito Genovese saw that the Allied forces were rapidly advancing in their invasion and would switch to their side, assisting them as an interpreter for the US Army. Also during this time, he would start up a black market operation that sold various products across southern Italy and Sicily with the help of the Sicilian Mafia. Later, after being arrested for running his black market business, it was discovered that Vito Genovese was wanted for murder in the US. After the war, he was deported back to America and tried for the 1934 murder that caused him to flee the country. On June 2, 1945, he was officially indicted for murder. Over the next year, all witnesses who could implicate Genovese were killed, and on June 10, 1946, all charges were dropped and Genovese returned to the Luciano crime family as a capo due to Frank Costello not wanting to step down as boss or replace his underboss Willie Moretti. By 1946, Thomas Dewey had been elected to the position of governor of New York. This meant that he had to commute Luciano's sentence as a result of his assistance in the war effort. Dewey commuted his sentence on the condition that he be deported to Italy, and on February 28th, he was put on a ship from Ellis Island in Brooklyn to Naples, Italy. Before this, he met with Anastasia, and they had dinner together. After the collapse of Lepke's organization and the end of the Second World War, Anastasia would return to overseeing activities on the waterfront. Also around this time, Anastasia would begin clashing with his boss, Vincent Mangano. Mangano had always been cautious of Anastasia's close relationships with Frank Costello and Charlie Luciano. In addition to this, he resented the fact that Anastasia would provide services to the other families without his consent. By 1951, Anastasia had decided to remove Mangano entirely in order to take the position of boss for himself. On April 19th, Vincent Mangano and his younger brother Philip would disappear. Later that same day, Philip's body would be discovered in a field near Jamaica Bay in Brooklyn with 3 gunshots to the face. Vincent Mangano would never be found. Immediately after the murders of the Mangano brothers, Anastasia would be called before the commission to explain why they were killed. At this time, the commission was made up of Frank Costello as boss of the Luciano family, Tommy Lucchese as boss of the Gagliano family, Joe Bonanno as boss of the Bonanno family, and Joe Profaci as boss of the Profaci family. Anastasia would tell the other families that he believed Mangano was going to have him killed. Despite the lack of evidence supporting his claims, Anastasia would be backed up by Frank Costello. As a result, the commission would accept his explanation and officially allow him to take the position of boss of the former Mangano family. In 1952, despite Anastasia being given full US citizenship for his contributions to the war effort, the federal government believed that he lied about never being arrested on his application. On April 15, 1954, his citizenship was officially revoked. However, his deportation proceedings were delayed due to an appeal that he had launched. During his time as boss of the Mangano family, various members of his family began to lose faith in him. At the same time, Luciano family boss Frank Costello had elevated Vito Genovese to the position of underboss after the 1951 murder of Willie Moretti. Genovese, however, was planning to take back the title of boss after 20 years. In doing this, he decided that he would need to kill Frank Costello. He likely saw an opportunity after the death of Willie Moretti and the 1956 deportation of high-ranking Luciano family member and Costello ally Joe Adonis. On May 2, 1957, Frank Costello was caught inside his apartment building at 115 Central Park West in Manhattan by Genovese gunman Vincent Gigante. Gigante would shoot Costello once in the head. However, the shot only grazed him and he would survive the attack, retiring soon after and relinquishing the title of boss to Genovese. Anastasia was furious after the attack on Costello, and he petitioned the commission to have Genovese killed. Meanwhile, Vito Genovese began to build a relationship with Anastasia family capo Carlo Gambino. Gambino was a very high-ranking member in the Sicilian faction of the family led by Joseph Riccobono. Riccobono had also previously led the Sicilian faction of the Di Aquila crime family in the 1920s. Gambino and Genovese were able to garner support from within the Anastasia family. They got on side Joe Riccobono and Joseph Biondo. Biondo was also a very powerful member of the family who went back to the days of Salvatore di Aquila. In early 1957, Anastasia underboss, Frank Scalise, was killed for allegedly selling membership to anyone willing to pay $50,000. All of this culminated in the death of Anastasia. On October 25, 1957, Anastasia was at the barbershop in the Park Sheraton Hotel at 7th Avenue and 55th Street in Manhattan. He was sitting in the barber chair when two gunmen approached and shot him 5 times. It is likely that he was killed by members of his own family after Genovese and Gambino were able to garner enough support to have him killed. After his death, he would be succeeded as boss by Carlo Gambino, who appointed Joe Riccobono to the position of consigliere and Joe Biondo to the position of underboss. Anastasia's brother Anthony would continue overseeing the operations on the waterfront for the Gambino family until his death in 1963.
I looked in your eyes, but all I could do was sigh. When you looked into mine, I saw love divine.
Carmine Persico Jr. was born on August 8, 1933, in Brooklyn, New York, to parents Carmine Persico Sr. and Assunta Plantamura. Carmine had an older brother, Alphonse, and a younger brother, Theodore. The Persico family lived in the Carroll Gardens neighborhood in Brooklyn. By the age of 16, Carmine had stopped attending school and would join the South Brooklyn Boys, an Italian-American street gang made up predominantly of young men involved in petty criminal activity. Carmine's brother, Alphonse, was also a member of this gang, likely having joined before Carmine. On May 12, 1950, the South Brooklyn Boys would get into a fight with a rival gang, the Tigers. When the fight was broken up by police, 18-year-old James Fortunato was discovered with a gunshot wound to the back. Fortunato was a member of the Tigers and would be pronounced dead at the scene. Members of both gangs would be arrested, including 16-year-old Carmine Persico and the shooter, 16-year-old Anthony Scarpati. Scarpati would go on to plead guilty to the charge of manslaughter, receiving a sentence of 15 to 30 years in prison. Persico and the others would be released after their charges were dropped. On the evening of January 9, 1951, Carmine and Alphonse Persico were about to arrive at their house at 637 Carroll Street when they were caught by 3 rival gang members. One of them fired 2 bullets at the Persico brothers, with both striking Carmine in the legs. The 3 assailants fled the scene and Carmine was taken to hospital, where he quickly recovered. On February 23rd, Alphonse Persico would gun down 26-year-old Steve Bove. Bove was allegedly one of the gang members responsible for shooting Carmine the previous month. After the murder, police would immediately begin looking for Alphonse, who had already gone on the run. On March 2nd, Carmine would be arrested and charged with the murder of Bove. However, the charges would soon be dropped due to a lack of evidence. On March 16th, Alphonse would turn himself in to police and would be charged with murder. On August 7th, he would plead guilty to the charge of second-degree murder, and on September 12th, he would be sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. By 1952, Carmine Persico's chaotic and violent reputation had brought him to the attention of Profaci family capo Francesco Franchi Shorts Abbatemarco. Abbatemarco ran several lucrative gambling operations, and he had complete control of the South Brooklyn numbers business, making him one of the family's greatest earners. On March 25, 1952, several raids were carried out with the objective of arresting some of the highest-ranking figures in the Brooklyn numbers business. 8 Profaci family members were arrested, including Frank Abbatemarco, his son Anthony, and Carmine Persico. Also arrested were brothers Larry and Joe Gallo. Everyone arrested would plead not guilty. However, Frank and Anthony Abbatemarco would both later plead guilty, with Frank going on to receive a 1-year sentence and Anthony receiving 9 months. Persico and the others would be acquitted. Later, Persico would be formally inducted into the Profaci crime family under Abbatemarco, eventually growing close to the Gallo brothers, who were already official members of the family. By the end of the 50s, Persico's boss, Franco Abbatemarco, had grown disillusioned with family boss Joe Profaci. He regarded Profaci as greedy and unreasonable, and decided to stop paying tribute to him. As a result, Profaci would order Abbatemarco's own soldiers, Larry and Joe Gallo, to kill him. Profaci promised the two that they would inherit Abbatemarco's territories and businesses if they carry out the murder. The Gallo brothers agreed to this and began planning to kill Abbatemarco. On the night of November 4th, 1959, Abbatemarco had just stepped outside of Cardello's Tavern at 256 4th Avenue in Brooklyn when the Gallo brothers approached him. One of them would shoot Abbatemarco in the back, causing him to run back inside the tavern. Both gunmen followed him in and shot another 4 bullets into him, leaving him in a critical condition. A few hours later, Abbatemarco would succumb to his wounds, passing away in hospital. After this, the Gallo brothers would wait for Profaci to finally give them what he promised. However, he never did. Franco Abbatemarco's businesses would instead be taken by Profaci, who only allowed his own loyalists to profit from them. This absolutely enraged the Gallos, particularly Joe Gallo, who immediately began plotting to get revenge. They began garnering support from within the family to make their next move. Early on, Persico, who was already close with the Gallo brothers, would join their faction. By 1961, the Gallos had figured out and meticulously planned a way to get back at Profaci. On February 27, 1961, Larry, Joe, and their other brother, Albert, orchestrated the kidnapping of several Profaci loyalists. They kidnapped family underboss Joe Magliocco, Profaci's brother, Frank, Capo Salvatore Musacchio, and soldier John Simone. The brothers intended on kidnapping Profaci as well, however, he was able to escape, fleeing to Florida. During this time, the Gallo brothers would make demands to Profaci. They demanded Profaci hand control of Abbatemarco's businesses to them. They would also demand a payment of $100,000 in exchange for the release of their 4 hostages. They were able to make their demands to Profaci through family capo John Francese, who was given the job of negotiating with them. Eventually, Profaci would give in and agree to meet the demands of the Gallo brothers on the condition they release their hostages first. Upon the release of the 4 hostages, Profaci would go back on the agreement and order the murders of everyone involved. On August 20th, 1961, Larry Gallo was summoned to a meeting at the Sahara Club in Flatbush, Brooklyn, under the pretense of negotiating a truce between the Gallo and Profaci factions. When Larry Gallo arrived, he would be ambushed by 3 men. One of these men would begin strangling Gallo with a wire, intending on killing him. This man was Carmine Persico. Earlier, Persico had switched to Profaci's side and was given the contract on Larry Gallo as a result. Before Gallo could lose consciousness, a police officer would walk in, resulting in the 3 men fleeing the scene. Later, Persico would be arrested for the attempted murder of Gallo. However, he would be released after Gallo refused to identify him. After Persico's betrayal of the Gallos, they would begin referring to him as the Snake, a name that would follow Persico for the rest of his criminal career. In November, Joe Gallo, the perceived leader of the Gallo faction, would be convicted on extortion charges stemming from his attempts to muscle in on a Brooklyn-based check-cashing business owned by businessman Theodore Moss, with Moss testifying against Gallo at trial. Joe Gallo would go on to receive a sentence of 7 to 14 years in prison. On June 6, 1962, Joe Profaci passed away from liver cancer. As a result, the family would be taken over by family underboss Joe Magliocco. After the death of Profaci and the imprisonment of Gallo faction leader Joe Gallo, the war appeared to slow down. However, it wasn't completely over. The Gallos were still gunning for Persico, resulting in 2 separate attempts on his life. Sometime in early 1963, the Gallos would have a bomb planted under Persico's car. However, Persico found the bomb before it could be detonated. On May 19, 1963, Persico, alongside another Profaci family member, Alphonse D'Ambrosio, were entering Persico's car on Bond Street in Brooklyn when a truck pulled up. 2 men began firing at Persico and D'Ambrosio, leaving them both wounded. Both men were taken to hospital, with them both ultimately surviving. Eventually, the war would officially come to an end after New England family boss Raymond Patriarca was able to successfully broker a peace agreement between the two factions. After the end of the war, family boss Joe Magliocco would conspire with Bonanno family boss Joe Bonanno to take full control of the commission by eliminating bosses Carlo Gambino, Tommy Lucchese, and a few others. Supposedly, this came as a result of Magliocco believing Lucchese and Gambino to have backed the Gallo brothers during the war. Magliocco would take responsibility for having the bosses murdered, delegating this monumental task to family capo Joseph Colombo. Instead of carrying out the murders, Colombo decided to alert Lucchese and Gambino to Bonanno and Magliocco's plans. This would result in both Bonanno and Magliocco being called before the commission to explain themselves. Magliocco attended this meeting. Bonanno, however, decided to flee to Montreal. The commission decided against having the two rogue bosses killed. Instead, they taxed Magliocco $50,000 and ordered him to step down as boss of the family. Upon Magliocco stepping down, Colombo would be appointed to the position of boss of the family by the commission. From this point, the hierarchy of the now Colombo crime family was Joe Colombo as boss, Salvatore Charlie Lemons Mineo as underboss, and Benedetto D'Alessandro as consigliere. Around this time, Persico would be appointed to the position of capo, with his crew being heavily involved in hijacking and loan sharking. During the 60s, Persico was engaged in a long legal battle stemming from his 1960 indictment for hijacking a truck carrying over $50,000 worth of merchandise. On May 9, 1968, he would be convicted after 5 trials due to the testimony of Mafia informant Joe Velacci. He would receive a 14-year sentence shortly after. However, he wouldn't actually begin serving this sentence until January 27, 1972, due to an appeal. In April of 1970, family boss Joe Colombo founded the Italian-American Civil Rights League, a political group established for the purpose of challenging stereotypes about Italian-Americans and the Mafia. Colombo decided to move forward with the movement in direct response to the arrest of his son, Joseph Jr. Jr. was arrested by the FBI in early 1970 for melting down coins for the purpose of reselling the silver. On April 30th, Colombo organized a protest outside the FBI headquarters in Manhattan, even having some members of his crime family attending the protest. From this point, the League grew more influential, with it receiving the support of many Italian-American politicians, and even Frank Sinatra, who performed at some events. Although the League provided a voice for the Italian-American population, it wasn't great for the Commission. In establishing the League, Colombo attracted a lot of federal attention to organized crime in New York. Allegedly, Carlo Gambino even forbade members of his family from attending League rallies. Despite this, the League flourished under Colombo and was a very positive force in Italian-American communities. However, things would only go downhill from here. On March 11, 1971, Joe Gallo would be released from prison on parole. Although his loyalists had accepted a truce with the Profaci faction, Gallo didn't. Colombo likely understood that Gallo would attempt to challenge him when he was released. As a result, he would offer Gallo $1,000 as a peace offering. Gallo refused to accept this and demanded $100,000, which Colombo refused to pay. From this point, Gallo would fully commit to challenging Colombo. He would begin building relationships with African-American gangsters, starting with future heroin kingpin Leroy Nicky Barnes, who he met in prison. Due to this, Gallo would have access to enforcers with no prior connections to any Italian bosses in New York. On June 28th, Colombo was on stage at a League rally in Columbus Circle, Manhattan, when he was shot 3 times. The gunman, 23-year-old African-American street hustler Jerome Johnson, hit Colombo in the head, back and neck, paralyzing him. Johnson was taken down by police officers when he himself was shot by Colombo's bodyguard Philip Rosello. Johnson was killed and Colombo was taken to hospital, where he would ultimately survive his wounds. Although he survived, he was completely paralyzed and had to spend weeks in Roosevelt Hospital before he could be taken home. With Colombo unable to ever return to the position of boss, a new boss would need to be elected. Initially, it was assumed that Colombo's underboss Salvatore Mineo would succeed him. However, Mineo felt he was too old to take over the family, with him retiring shortly after. Ultimately, the title of boss would be given to Joseph Iacovelli. After the attempt on Colombo's life, the family would arrange to have Joe Gallo killed in retaliation, assuming him to have been behind the shooting. On April 7, 1972, Joe Gallo was at Umberto's Clam House on Mulberry Street in Lower Manhattan with his family and his bodyguards celebrating his 43rd birthday. While Gallo was dining with his family, a man walked in and began firing at him. He was hit and began running towards the door. The gunman kept firing and hit him in the back, with this shot proving fatal. Joe Gallo was taken to hospital where he was pronounced dead. After the death of Joe Gallo, his loyalists would target Joseph Iacovelli. After an attempt on his life, Iacovelli would flee New York, leaving his family without a boss. Due to this, Carmine Persico would be elected boss of the family while he was serving his sentence. Due to him being incarcerated, he would need to run the family through his brother, Alphonse. Alphonse Persico was Carmine's consigliere, being one of very few mobsters to be inducted when the membership books were closed from 1957 to 1976. In February of 1976, the membership books were reopened, and each family was allowed to induct 10 prospective members. Alphonse Persico would sponsor the inductions of his and Carmine's childhood friend and early criminal associate Anthony Scarpati and their close associate Gennaro Jerry Langella. Before their inductions, both Scarpati and Langella had spent years building their criminal businesses. As a result, they would rise the ranks fairly quickly. As for the Gallo faction, it had been disbanded after Albert Gallo was transferred to the Genovese family as a way to maintain order within the Colombo family. On December 15, 1979, Carmine Persico was released from prison on parole, finally allowing him to run the family himself. Soon after Persico's release, Scarpati would be made a capo in the family. One of the men working under him was Greg Scarpa, also known as the Grim Reaper. Despite his status as a soldier, Scarpa ran his own crew, operating on 13th Avenue in Brooklyn. Scarpa was also known for his brutality, being considered one of the Colombo family's most feared enforcers during his early career. At this point, Carmine Persico was at the peak of his power. However, he wouldn't be on the streets for very long. On August 11, 1981, less than 2 years after being released from prison, he would plead guilty to attempting to bribe an IRS agent, going on to receive a 5-year sentence. While he was in prison and his brother was acting boss, they would decide to appoint Jerry Langella to the position of underboss. In March of 1984, Persico would be released from prison. By September, Alphonse Persico had begun to suspect his girlfriend, 31-year-old Mary Barry, of being an informant. Due to this, he decided to have her killed, giving this task to Greg Scarpa. Naturally, he would need to get the approval of Scarpa's capo, Anthony Scarpati, who reluctantly agreed. Scarpati even said to Scarpa's son, Greg Scarpa Jr., quote, "We're probably going to go to hell for this." On September 24th, Scarpa had family soldier Carmine Cecil lure Barry to his club at 6908 13th Street in Brooklyn, under the pretense of giving her a job. When she arrived, she was caught by Scarpa and his son. Greg Jr. held her down while his father shot her 3 times in the head. The two men then left her body on a curb beneath the F train subway line in South Brooklyn, where it was discovered hours later. Also in 1984, the family would be dealt a crippling blow. On October 14, federal racketeering indictments would come down against several high-ranking Colombo family members, including the entire leadership. Indicted were Carmine Persico, Jerry Langella, Anthony Scarpati, and several others. When the indictments came down, Carmine fled to Hempstead, New York, where he would hide out with his cousin, Fred DeChristopher. Unfortunately, the person he chose to stay with was an informant who gave up his location to the FBI. On February 15, 1985, Carmine Persico was arrested by the FBI and held without bail pending trial. In the Colombo family case, all defendants except family soldier Ralph Scopo were held without bail. Scopo was only given bail due to his health issues. 10 days after, Carmine Persico was charged with several counts of racketeering in what was known as the Colombo family case. He would be indicted on charges related to a separate case. On February 25th, federal indictments would come down against the bosses of all 5 New York crime families and some of their subordinates. Some of the mobsters indicted were Gambino family boss Paul Castellano, Genovese family boss Anthony Fat Tony Salerno, Lucchese family boss Anthony Tony Dux Corallo, Bonanno family boss Philip Rusty Rastelli, and Carmine Persico. The case was brought by New York Southern District Attorney Rudy Giuliani, who alongside the FBI had been building a case against the New York Mafia for years using surveillance, wiretaps, and informants. The case was mainly based on the Mafia's alleged control of the construction industry in New York. As a result, indictments in this case would reach Jerry Langella and Ralph Scopo, who both had major interests in the construction industry. On June 13, 1986, the Colombo family trial would conclude with every defendant being convicted. On November 17th, sentences would be handed down. Carmine Persico was sentenced to 39 years in prison, Jerry Langella was sentenced to 65 years, and Anthony Scarpati was sentenced to 35 years. While this was going on, Persico was also being tried in the Five Families case. During this trial, he would act as his own attorney, often meeting with his legal advisor. Also during this trial, 2 defendants would be dropped. Bonanno family boss Philip Rastelli was dropped from the case due to another federal indictment he was facing, and Gambino family boss Paul Castellano was murdered on December 16, 1985. On November 19, 1986, every defendant in the Five Families case would be found guilty, including Persico, Langella, and Scopo.
In the still of the night, I can hear the voices. In echoes of the rooftops, they're calling out to me.
On January 13, 1987, the bosses and their subordinates would all receive 100-year sentences. With that, Persico was now serving a total of 139 years in federal prison. Despite this, he wasn't willing to give up his title of boss of the Colombo family, even though every one of his potential acting bosses were in prison, with Alphonse Persico also serving a lengthy sentence as a result of his conviction in a separate extortion case. As a result, from 1987, the family would be taken over by a ruling panel of 3 capos, Benedetto Aloi, Vincent Jimmy Angelino, and Joseph Tomasello. After a while, however, the family would be taken over by Vittoro Little Vicorina, who was entrusted to take the position of acting boss for Persico. As a result, Orina would order Carmine Sessa, who is now the family's consigliere, to poll the captains on whether he should take full control of the family. Soon after this, Orina would petition the commission to recognize him as the official boss of the Colombo family. During this time, Orina was in a strong position as he had the full backing of Gambino family boss John Gotti. Meanwhile, instead of doing what Orina ordered, Sessa sent word to Persico informing him of Orina's plans. Persico would then order Sessa to arrange Orina's murder. On June 20th, 1991, Orina was driving to his house when he noticed a car parked outside. This car contained 5 enforcers who were waiting for Orina to arrive home so they could kill him. However, Orina recognized some of the men in the car, and instead of going home, he turned around and sped away from the scene. After this failed attempt on his life, Orina would retaliate against the Persico faction by ordering the murder of Persico loyalist Greg Scarpa. On November 18th, Scarpa was driving in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn with his daughter and grandson. His daughter and grandson were in a separate car following him when a truck pulled alongside his car. Several men jumped out and began firing at him. Scarpa went down and then accelerated, speeding past a stop sign and escaping. Although Orina's faction seemed stronger, Scarpa had a resource that gave him a significant advantage. Since 1961, Greg Scarpa had been an active FBI informant. However, he wasn't an informant in the traditional sense. He had spent the last 30 years using his position to further his criminal career by playing both sides, and his connections to the FBI proved very useful in the war. During this time, Scarpa was receiving information from agent Lindley DeVecchio. DeVecchio was able to give Scarpa information on his enemies, allowing him to track them down and kill them. Scarpa also had little to lose by this point. In 1986, after receiving surgery for a stomach ulcer, Scarpa would contract HIV he received that was donated by an associate of his who carried the disease. Eventually, he would go on to develop AIDS, which during this time was a terminal illness. Scarpa would also be motivated to wipe out the Orina faction due to the fact that gunmen ambushed him in front of his family, which could have put their lives in danger. On December 6, Scarpa and a few of his enforcers arrived at 310 Bay 11th Street, the house of Arena faction soldier Vincent Fusaro. As Fusaro was putting up Christmas lights, Scarpa shot him with a high-powered rifle. When Fusaro was on the ground, Scarpa approached, stood over him and put another 2 bullets in his head, leaving him dead on the scene. From this point, the war between the Persico and Arena factions grew more heated every day. On January 7, 1992, Nicholas Nicky Black Grancio was sitting in his car in the Gravesend neighborhood in Brooklyn when Scarpa approached and shot him in the head with a shotgun, killing him instantly. Grancio was a capo in the Arena faction, making him the highest-ranking member of the faction to be murdered by Scarpa. Grancio had also been under constant FBI surveillance, with this only stopping the night he was killed. Also, in 1992, rival faction leader Vic Arena was indicted on several federal charges including murder, with him being arrested on April 4, 1992. Meanwhile, due to his illness, Scarpa had filed a lawsuit against the hospital that performed his blood transfusion, and on August 30th, he received a settlement of $300,000 from the hospital. Soon after he received the settlement, Scarpa was arrested for racketeering conspiracy and placed on house arrest. He was most likely granted bail as a result of his deteriorating condition. On December 22nd, acting boss Vic Arena would be convicted on racketeering and murder charges, going on to receive 3 life sentences plus 85 years in federal prison. On December 29th, Scarpa's son Joey told his father that he had been threatened by 2 drug traffickers and Lucchese family associates, Marvin Moran and Michael DeRosa. Joey Scarpa was allegedly also a drug dealer and got into an altercation with the 2 men as they had been selling drugs on his territory. Despite being on house arrest and wearing an ankle monitor, Scarpa went with his son and his friend Joe Randazzo to confront the 2 men. Upon arriving at DeRosa's house, things became heated and a shootout ensued. Greg Scarpa shot DeRosa in the stomach and Moran shot Randazzo in the head, killing him instantly. Moran also hit Greg Scarpa in the eye, wounding him. After this, Joey drove his father to the Mount Sinai Hospital in Manhattan, where he was arrested for violating the terms of his bail. By 1993, the war was over and the Persico faction had officially won. Not only was Arena in prison, but his closest ally, John Gotti, was also in prison. From this point, Carmine Persico would exert his control over the family from prison. As for Greg Scarpa, he was sentenced to life in prison on December 15, 1993, after pleading guilty to racketeering and murder charges. However, after a review, his sentence was changed to 10 years due to his condition. On June 4, 1994, he would pass away in the Federal Medical Center in Rochester, Minnesota, due to complications from AIDS. Carmine Persico would remain the official boss of the Colombo crime family until his death on March 7, 2019.